Welcome to This Club Sucks, grief support for parents after the lasagnas are long gone. I am your host, Melissa Monroe, here with my co-host, Alexandria Seamock. Each week we record our child loss chat on Twitter Spaces, where we explore topics around grief and trauma. Whether you are a bereaved parent, want to support bereaved parents, or exploring other sources of grief, we'll be here holding space after the lasagnas are long gone.
Oh, this club sucks.
Welcome everyone to Child Loss Chat on Twitter Spaces, which is recorded for my podcast, This Club Sucks, grief support for parents after the lasagnas are long gone. Today, our guest is Jody Pupecki. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She is a fellow SUDC parent and a board member of the Compassionate Friends. Welcome, Jody. And would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came to both the SUDC group and the Compassionate Friends?
Hi. Yes. Thank you, Melissa, for having me, and Dr. A as well. My name is Jody Pupecki. We lost our 1 year and 21-day-old son, Tyler, back in 2006. And it's actually kind of a funny story, how I kind of came not only connected with SUDC, but also Compassionate Friends. So I have 5 older brothers, and my oldest brother was a television reporter in upstate New York. And when Tyler passed, and some of his colleagues had heard the story of Tyler passing, one of his colleagues actually reached out to him and said, "Hey, I just did a piece on SUDC. Do you know anything about it? And does your sister know anything about it?" So it was a very roundabout way that I was actually kind of made aware that there was some support options out there for people who had lost a child. For me, that I did work with SUDC in the beginning, but I was drawn to Compassionate Friends just because of the proximity. I'm very fortunate enough to have a chapter that meets pretty local to me, about 20 minutes away. And so unfortunately, being surrounded by like people means I had to find people who also lost a child. So in that sense, it was unfortunate, but I was very lucky to connect with the local Compassionate Friends to get monthly support, and we've been going ever since.
That is amazing. And where are you located again, Jody?
So I'm located in Leominster, Massachusetts, which is basically north central Massachusetts. We're north of Worcester, and obviously west of Boston.
Yeah, so, I know that's a problem for a lot of people. If you're not located in a major city, it's obviously far more difficult to find support groups for anything, really. And with SUDC, it's so rare. Sometimes there's only a few of us even in the same state, much less the same city. Like I'm in LA, and for a while there were a couple of families here, and one moved away, and there might be some that I don't know about. But even in a big city like LA, there's not really enough of us that you could even create much of a group that could all possibly have a chance of meeting at the same time. So when you first, how soon after your child died did you start going to the Compassionate Friends group meetings?
So our local Compassionate Friends meets the first Thursday of every month. So Tyler passed away on November 17th. By the time, it takes forever to get out of that kind of shock phase. It takes a very long time. But by the time we were kind of somewhat aware enough and connected to realize that we had a local Compassionate Friends near us, we had missed that first Thursday in December, a few weeks after Tyler had passed. So we had to wait until the first Thursday in January of 2007 before we could go to our first meeting. So I am very fortunate that I was connected quite quickly to understand that we had a local support, compassionate friends near us. Even now, this many years later, still being very active in our local chapter, it just surprises me the number of people that connect with us that say, I had no idea you existed, or I wish I had found you sooner. And there's, many reasons for that. In the beginning, way back in 2006, 2007, it's definitely a much different marketing space back then. The way that you could get the word out versus how easy it is digitally to get the word out now. But also part of that is when you're in the beginning of your grief, that fog, it's hard to process putting your socks on, much less coordinating and finding the space and energy to get up and actually go to a local meeting. So,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you barely know your name. I think especially when the loss is unexpected, or in our case, unexpected and unexplained, that the shock just lasts longer. It just does. And I don't know about you, but for me, I feel like the real grief, not that I wasn't grieving the whole time, mind you, but the real work of grief, the real task of, what grief needed to do with me didn't really start until the shock began to wear off, and that was months for me. How about you?
absolutely. One of the things when there's a lot of key points that I take away from compassionate friends. One of the key things that we always tell newly bereaved people that come through our doors is that compassionate friends considers you newly bereaved for 5 years. And we also make sure to share our experiences with newly bereaved members who come through our door, that the second year is often much harder than the first year. There's many different ways to describe this, but the first year you're kind of, in shock forever. And, the way that I envision it is that first year of grief, you're basically surrounded by a big cotton ball, and it kind of protects you and only lets through the things that you can handle. And over the first year, that cotton ball layers, they tend to start falling off, and the veil of cotton gets thinner and thinner, and more things come through. So if it hadn't been for my local compassionate friends, the veteran grievers, I guess we could call them, sharing their experiences with me to tell me, hey, for most people, the second year is actually much harder than the first year, because that layer of cotton cushion is pretty much worn off by the end of the first year, and the second year can often be a bit rawer than even the first year. And if I hadn't been prepared for that, I'm not quite sure where I would have found myself that second year.
Oh, I agree. The second year is harder. I think for many reasons. I think, in my experience, you just don't have the amount of support pouring in that you do right away. I mean, right after it happens, I don't know about you, but I think this is pretty standard. The amount of support, especially when it's a child, that pours in immediately is nearly overwhelming. And but I didn't want to say no because I knew I needed it, and I knew that it wouldn't last. So part of me knew immediately that I had to accept help, whether though I'm one that tends to, you know, no, I got it. No, I couldn't possibly bother you. Blah 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 blah. I had to undo that. Uh, Thanks to my friend Bubba, who snapped me out of that real quick, because it was clear to me right away that that wasn't going to last forever. People have their own problems, and new people have tragedies, and it's just that's just how it is. This is not an indictment on anyone, of course. It's just the way it is. So I think there's a lack of support, and B, the expectations to, quote, live normally and carry on normally when you're probably only just starting to experience real grief is extremely challenging. Was that similar to your experience, Jody?
100%. I think one of the things, I think everyone in the world understands that loss is just a part of the natural order of things, right? So, in that regards, everybody at some point experiences loss. I think what we found after that initial outpouring of grief, support from friends and families and even people who we least expected were supporting us. People, a few things. They want the old you. They want you to be back to normal because your grief is very uncomfortable for them. For many, your grief is uncomfortable because they're scared it's going to happen to them. It's a unnatural and unknown loss. Losing a child. You expect your parents to go before you. You expect possibly your significant other to go before you. You expect possibly siblings to go before you, but never in a million years is it, unless it has happened to somebody that you know, do you ever expect to lose a child and to still be here and your child is not? So we found as time went on, people didn't understand why we were still grieving so deeply, because they were relating it to their experiences of loss of a parent or maybe even loss of a significant other. That, yes, it's painful and it is awful, but eventually you work your way through it and move on and you find yourself in a happier space. And I think what we found in the beginning was it was very hard to articulate, one, because we didn't know really what we were going through. But now looking back, it's hard to articulate that losing a child is not only are you losing, you're grieving for the loss of that person, but you're grieving the loss of what should have been, what could have been, what was supposed to have been. So, I will never know. He was 1 year and 21 days old. I will never know what his favorite color was. I will never have seen him get on the bus to go to kindergarten. I will never know if he would have been athletic or artistic or musical or any of those things. I will never see him graduate, drive a car, go to the prom, go to college, graduate from college, see him get married. So that normal grief that everybody experiences at some point gets amplified and just revisited over the years when all of those milestones are supposed to hit. And I think that's the piece that people around, at least for us, people around us didn't get. Well, why is it 5 years later and you're still signing Angel Tyler on your cards? Like, that's not normal, quote unquote. Like when your significant other dies, you don't sign your Christmas cards after they've passed, Jody and Keith. You usually just sign it Jody. So there's a lot of that misunderstanding that happens because it is so unusual, the loss of a child and all that comes with it. So we do Christmas letters, and we do still sign, Angel Tyler, and we've learned over the years just ways to incorporate our child in all of the things that we do, not just during the holidays, but, all of the things that we do. I know some people in their grief don't feel as comfortable being so outright with that grief. So one of the things that I love about Compassionate Friends and going to those meetings and sharing our experiences and stories with others is that's probably my second best lesson I ever learned from going to my Compassionate Friends meetings, was that there is such a huge spectrum of the way people will react to certain scenarios, and what works for one person or is right for one person or one family could be completely wrong for another family. I will never forget this story. I remember being in one of my local chapter meetings, and one of the attendees at the chapter just was so upset. And he is like, you know, my son's college keeps sending mail in my son's name. And he's like, I finally called up the school and said, my son is gone. If I receive another letter from you with my son's name on it, I will sue you. And in that very same meeting, there was another gentleman who was like, oh, you know, I have a little bit of a different perspective. He's like, every time I get a letter with my daughter's name on it, he's like, I have a mailbox in my house and I love getting mail with her name on it. And I have this mailbox, and every letter that I get, I put in there, and I feel like I've just been touched or kissed by her. And I love getting mail with her name on it. It's like she hasn't been forgotten. So that was probably my second biggest lesson in my local Compassionate Friends, was really understanding that as you could react and handle things completely differently, and that is 100% okay, as long as we're honoring each other's grief journey. And that understanding that the way that you might respond or choose to handle something might be completely different than another person's, that it is 100% okay, because we are all so unique in our individual grief journeys. Even when losing the same person, you know, my husband and I, we lost the same person, but our journeys are so very different.
So are you saying basically that even the people who've lost children themselves respond as differently as the people who haven't lost children? Like, they ask you why you're still signing the cards that way?
So I think it's a twofold answer. I think the first one, in terms of people who have also lost a child, I've learned from Compassionate Friends that we all don't react the same to whatever it is that the topic is about. And I gave that male example that there was one chapter member who was ready to sue his son's college if he received another piece of mail in his son's name. And then in the very same meeting, there was another chapter member who has his own mailbox and just dances his way, you know, when he receives a letter with his daughter's name on it, he puts it in his own little mailbox that he keeps inside the house, and it's like a great day for him. So in that regard, Compassionate Friends and the experience and interactions I've had, that's another great lesson Compassionate Friends has taught me, is that it's okay to grieve differently, and the way that you're doing it doesn't mean that it's wrong, or the way that somebody else is doing it isn't necessarily wrong either. And that was prime with my husband and I. You know, not only do men and women grieve differently, but even people grieving the loss of the same person grieve very differently. If I'm a hot mess on the floor, you know, in a puddle, and my husband is not, it doesn't mean that he didn't love Tyler any less. It was just he handled it much differently. So in regards to grievers, that it, you know, people grieve very uniquely. We're all snowflakes, right? No one is the same. In terms of people outside of that grieving bubble, the people who I feel are very fortunate to have no understanding of what it's like to lose a child, a couple of things. I've actually found in my grief journey that some people that I thought I'd get the most support from were actually the least supportive and understanding. And then there were people that I never in a million years thought would have understood, at least even a prism of my grief, and got support from people who hadn't lost a child, that I never expected would have some sliver of understanding of what that was like. So there are people that are like, it is 15 years later or 16 years later, and she still signs in her Christmas cards, Angel Tyler. And in the beginning, I cared what people thought. And then over time, I learned that I just didn't care. It wasn't about them. It was about what I needed in my grief journey. It was about teaching my children, because at the time that Tyler passed, I had a daughter who was 2.11. She wasn't quite 3 years old yet. And then we did have a subsequent child after Tyler died. So it was important for me and my husband to make sure that even though Tyler wasn't physically present with us, that our children knew he was still very much a part of our family. So it took me a little while to not care. I wasn't there to my grief didn't have to be dictated by the thoughts or the norms of everybody else. I had to give myself permission to grieve in whatever manner that took on and be okay with it, that if it was different than somebody else's.
Yeah, I understand that. And I really relate to what you were saying about having other kids. It felt important to me right after to do. There were some things that I did that mainly I did because I thought my daughter is 4. I have to include Alice's name on this so that she knows that if something happened to her, I would never forget her. Because children that age are developmentally appropriately self-centered. That's what they're supposed to be. And so they're going to look at it all through the guise of what would this mean for me. And I thought, I'm putting Alice's name on the Christmas card because if I was 4 years old and my mom just suddenly stopped doing that, I would wonder, would my mom remember me if I passed away? So I totally get that, Jody. And I just want to say something real quick about how you were saying people grieve differently and individually we grieve differently. I've said this many times on this show. Not only do different people experience a death differently, different people experience different deaths differently. We individually grieve different people differently, and we individually grieve the same person differently minute to minute. So, any expectation that two people or a group of people would grieve the same way at the same time forever and ever is a really toxic concept that creates a lot of unnecessary problems. That said, it can be very difficult to, if you're someone that needs to be very private about your grief at a certain time, and your partner or your sibling or whoever needs more support and needs more people around, that can be really challenging if you live in the same house. And so that leads to some difficult conversations. So it's not all just so, well, everyone grieves differently. It sounds like it's nice, tidy little sentence, but it's often not so tidy. And that is why groups like the Compassionate Friends are so important. And the person who might need more people involved in their grieving process have that option, and their partner or their sibling or whoever else lives in the house that wants it to be more private can have that experience as well. Which brings me to a couple of questions about the Compassionate Friends as an organization. So, how many chapters does the Compassionate Friends have in America? And I believe you're international.
Yeah, that's a great question. It kind of ebbs and flows, but on average right now there's about 520 chapters serving all of the 50 states
Wow.
plus Washington D.C. and Puerto Rico. So there are, that might sound like a lot, but there's still such a need for more chapters to be available to people all over the U.S. In terms of international, there's more than 30 countries that have a Compassionate Friends presence. So it is definitely available all over the world.
That's incredible. I mean, that is incredible. And yes, I know exactly what you mean. There's so many more than 520 cities. And I understand your need and applaud your desire to create more. But that is really an impressive feat. For those folks who don't have a chapter nearby, or for folks like me, who there is a chapter nearby, but they meet on a night that I have my kid in between, picking her up and her treatments and her school. I just can't get there on Thursdays. Do you have virtual meetings for people who can't either make their local chapter or don't have a local chapter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first and foremost, if you go to compassionatefriends.org, there is a chapter locator right at the top of the website. So if you type in your zip code, you'll find chapters that are near you, and you can actually filter within a certain mile radius as well. So you might know of a local chapter, Melissa, but there might actually be another one, maybe just 5 or 10 miles away or 15 miles away that you weren't aware of. So first check that chapter locator, because there might be another chapter that you might be able to make. That being said, when you do use the chapter resource locator, the results that you will get will tell you if that specific chapter offers virtual options as well. There are some chapters out there that actually are hybrid. So while people do go and meet in person, they will actually Zoom it, do a Zoom conference at the same time, and people can remote into that live chapter session. There are some chapters out there that actually separate it. They might 1 week have an in-person chapter meeting, and then 2 weeks later offer a virtual option. So there are chapters out there that do offer virtual options. I have yet to hear of a chapter that does not welcome somebody just because they don't live in that local area. Our chapter was fortunate enough that during the pandemic, we had the funds and the resources and the technology to offer virtual to our members. And we often had people from all over the United States join our chapter because we were hosting that virtual option. The other thing too, I know for me, we were talking about unique grief journeys. When I got to my Compassionate Friends meeting, and I think my jaw dropped to the ground, and I'm like, wait a second, you people only meet once a month. What in the world do you do for the other 29 or 28 days? Like, I can't wait another month. So, Compassionate Friends is also on Facebook. They have over I think it's 40 private groups that are available 24/7. And the reason why there's so many groups is because they have separated it by kind of topic or category, because yes, losing a child, a grandchild, or a sibling is a unique bucket in and of itself, but the cause of loss presents its own unique journey. For example, a loss of a child, a grandchild, or a sibling due to long-term illness, or infant or young child loss, or sudden unexplained, or I should say sudden loss, murder, death by suicide, so on and so forth. There's even groups like, I'm a grandparent and now I have to take care of my grandkids because I lost my child and now I'm their guardians, things like that. So we always encourage people in our chapter, if they are needing more support. Obviously, there's always therapy options out there. There's no shame in therapy. If that is what fits and works for you, definitely seek out those options. Facebook groups, those are 24/7. They are moderated by some pretty amazing compassionate friends. So if you need that support more than just once a month, and I'm sure I'm not the only grieving parent out there that it's 2 a.m. and my brain is racing and I can't get to sleep and I'm losing my mind and just needed to know I wasn't alone. So those are some other virtual or electronic options that people do have.
That's amazing. And I love how they're split up between groups. Each week I cover different topics, and that means that weekly I can have a very different audience because, as you say, each kind of loss has a different flavor, so to speak. A loss after a long illness is no more or less difficult than a sudden death, but it's going to look different and it's going to play out different. A loss due to murder is going to play out very differently than a loss like suicide. They all have unique flavors and deserve people that understand those unique aspects of that journey. So it's beautiful that you have those Facebook groups that are so specific. I think that's really important, and I really applaud you for that. I know that, and by the way, all the links that we're talking about here will be in the chat, and they will also be linked on the podcast when I splice this broken show together later. Jody, I wondered if you could talk to us for a minute about what you found the most supportive about the Compassionate Friends. Like what service, what aspect of being involved in the Compassionate Friends have you found benefited you most? And then what led you to want to become a board member and really make it a big part of your life?
So I think one of the biggest lessons from Compassionate Friends that I've learned is that men and women grieve differently, that grievers grieve differently, that, where the mailbox scenario, it was such an eye-opener to see that there wasn't one set path. And I know they talk about the 5 stages of grief, quote unquote, but even learning, well, yes, those stages of grief are pretty normal for most people. There's no set order. And once you have gotten through one, quote unquote, like anger possibly, that doesn't mean that that is closed and done with, because boy, you can revisit any one of those stages at any time. It is definitely, grief is not even like a roller coaster. If I took like a Sharpie pen on a wall, I would just scribble all up and down, left and right, and in circles, and there is no straight path from A to B in your grief journey. So that was huge for us. Another thing that was very important that I learned from Compassionate Friends was that the second year is often harder for most people than the first, and that Compassionate Friends considers you newly bereaved for 5 years. So I think probably the last big key point that I learned in the beginning with Compassionate Friends, I remember going to my first meeting, and you sit down and you don't have to speak if you don't want to, but there's an opportunity at the beginning for each person to go around and say who they are and say a little bit about their loved one. And I remember one of the members, she had lost her child like 25 or 30 years ago. And I thought to myself, holy crap, if she is still here, there is no hope for me to somehow navigate this horrific loss. And it took me a little bit to realize that she wasn't there because she needed it to survive anymore. She was there because she got to a place in her grief journey that she was able to turn around and help others. So, and I think that's a great lead-in as to why I found myself kind of on the radar of the national organization, and being part of the board was not only was I able in my local chapter to provide support for others, but being part of the national board gives me the ability to kind of open up that umbrella and help so many across the country with their grieving, because it's very important that Compassionate Friends sticks around, and it's volunteers and board members and the staff at TCF that make sure that those such needed resources for families that are grieving the loss of a child, a grandchild, or sibling have those resources and support to help them.
It's really just incredible, Jody. I want to we're running out of time. So before that, I just want to run over a few of the other services that the Compassionate Friends provide. And if then you want to pick one and say a few words about it, if you find yourself as a newly bereaved parent, first of all, my heart holds you forever. I'm so sorry you will ever need this. But you can request a bereavement resource guide, and we will attach all of these links. She mentioned the Facebook groups. There is a national website. They have annual worldwide candle lighting to honor the departed children. There's a conference. I'm very excited about this, educating employers when they have a bereaved employee. I mean, oh my God, this really, I'm so happy you're doing it. And I think we can all agree that this needs a lot more juice behind it, because there's some pretty terrible stories out there about what parents were expected to do 3 days after their child died unexpectedly, or even expectedly. And there's a whole list of events, but those are all various ways the compassionate friends can provide support to the newly bereaved. Did you want to touch on any of those, Jody?
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to point out is that although my personal experience has been about a loss of a child, Compassionate Friends actually supports if you have lost a sibling, and also if you have lost a grandchild. So I know a lot of our talk today has been strictly child loss, but I want to make sure that it's clear to all of your listeners that if you've lost a sibling, that grief journey is so unique, because not only did you possibly lose your best friend, but you're watching your parents go through this. I mean, that's a whole nother layer of grief in that regards. And then grandparents as well. You know, not only did you lose your grandchild, but you are watching your child go through the most unimaginable grief possible. So that is a whole unique prism in and of itself. So I wanted to make sure that that's clear out there, that TCF is both loss of a child, grandchild, and a sibling. And that TCF is working really hard for outreach, because how many times does someone say, I didn't know you existed? If I had known you existed, I would have come sooner. So, you know, even at the national level and at the local level, chapters are working on outreach with funeral homes and pediatricians and hospitals and things like that, to make sure that our resources are in their hands and can be given to the grieving families. The national conference. So every year, the national conference is located in a different state, in a different town. So they try to make it, go all across the country, so that hopefully we're near a city near you where it's affordable for you to come. So whether it's the national conference next year, it's going to be July 7th through 9th in Denver, Colorado. Whether you go to the national conference or you go to a meeting, I can't say enough about surrounding yourself with people who in some ways understand what you're going through. Because sometimes you just needed to hear one person say one thing and it just lights up. And I'm not the only one that feels that way, or I'm not crazy, or someone else thinks the same thing. And sometimes just it softens your burden just a little bit, knowing that others are helping you carry that grief along in your journey.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, besides the support meetings, other ways the Compassionate Friends supports bereaved parents.
So that's a great question. There are a lot of ways. If you are a social media guru, or maybe even not a guru, but are on social media, the national chapter has many, many private Facebook groups that you can partake in. Some of the best features about these private groups are, one, they're 24/7. So I know for me, when I was newly bereaved, our local chapter just met once a month. And I thought to myself, what in the world am I going to do for the other 29 days of the month until the next meeting? So Facebook is great because it's 24/7 and you can go at any time Also, if you were like me early on in grief, I had a really hard time sleeping. So when my mind was racing and it's 2 a.m. and I felt so isolated and alone because I was the only one awake, I was able to go on Facebook, and there was always somebody there, either that I could talk to, communicate with, or sometimes just hearing other people's stories or seeing what was going on and hearing people's comments. It was great to know that I wasn't alone. The other great thing about the private Facebook groups is that we all share a common thread of losing the loss of someone really important to us, the loss of a child, a grandchild, or sibling. That being said, and our common thread of understanding and being compassionate about the loss, there's something to be said about surrounding yourself with people who experienced a very similar type of loss. For example, Tyler was only 1 year and 21 days old. He passed away of overheating. He had a temperature of 108.3. So that was the official cause, that he overheated. But from there, we had no answers. It was unexplained. They couldn't tell us why he had such a high fever. So we dealt with a lot of that unexplained. So the reason why I'm pointing out causes is that I will never understand. I will be very compassionate about it, but I never will truly understand what it's like for someone who's walking the grief journey of death by suicide or long-term illness or murder, or even the loss of an older child. I don't have all of those memories and experiences. I don't know what my son's favorite color was. Would he be an artist, an athlete, or any of those types of things? So when I get together, it's nice to be able to communicate with others who have lost a child that's younger, because they understand that nuance of that grief. Also, every year on the second Sunday of December, the Compassionate Friends has a worldwide candle lighting. And basically, at 7 p.m. in your time zone, you can light a candle in memory of your loved one. And the idea is that wave of light eventually will make it all the way around the globe when it starts at 7 p.m. And if you don't have a local chapter that has a local candle lighting that you can go to in person, National actually has a virtual candle lighting that you can partake in, join in. So that's another way to remember and honor and get support as well, because that second Sunday in December is, a few weeks after Thanksgiving, but a few weeks before Christmas and the New Year's. So, during the holidays, it's very difficult. And so the candle lighting is a great opportunity not only to honor and remember your loved one, but also to find support and comfort as well. The other thing that I did want to point out is every year, somewhere in the United States, the Compassionate Friends has a conference. They try to pick different locations throughout the United States. So here I'm in Boston. So a conference in California might make it a little difficult for me to travel if I don't have the means and the finances. But they've had them in Boston. They've had them in the middle of the United States. So people look out for those annual yearly conferences. The next conference is actually going to be July 7th through 9th, 2023, and it's going to be in Denver, Colorado. So if you're able to make that trip, or you're local to that, for one whole weekend, you are surrounded by people who just get it. And there's so much hope and support and compassion when you go to a national conference. It's pretty amazing.
That is amazing. I have gone to the SUDC retreat before once, because I think we went in 2019 and then it was COVID. So they had to cancel it. And I mainly went for my daughter's benefit, my surviving daughter's benefit. I kind of felt like I didn't need it. But once I got there and they gave just the simple act, all of the name tags had Melissa, Alice's mom. And then for an entire weekend, everyone called me Alice's mom. And I didn't know how much I needed that or missed that. And so I I saw the light. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So it's so wonderful that you have those national conferences and that you move them around and make it easier for people to join a different year if it's too complicated for them to travel. I love that. One thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned that you educate employers when they have a bereaved employee, and I would like to learn a bit more about that because it's so important. Our bereavance leave in this country leaves a lot to be desired. I met a woman whose daughter was killed while she was at college, and just trying to get the body back was far more days than she had off from work. And they ended up sorting it out, and her colleagues pitched in to give her and donated days. But I mean, it's obviously not ideal and just a whole nother stressor that you shouldn't have to worry about when you've already lost a child unexpectedly. So I'd like to learn a little bit about what you do with employers.
So there's actually a pamphlet that you can request from the national office. But in general, everybody experiences loss. That's the natural part of life. I think the big thing that's difficult for not only employers, but also just family and friends and people around that mourning family is that it's not the natural order of things. And it often takes, quote unquote, much longer than our typical, hey, 3 days bereavement, you can have off of work and then come back and do your thing. And it's very hard for employers.
It's laughable, really.
It is 100% laughable. And it's often hard for employers to understand that this kind of grief is just different. Things that they could expect or see from their employees that are grieving. It's often people can experience some or all of the following: difficulty in making decisions, inability to concentrate, disinterest in their job related details, frustration, irritability, depression, and mood swings. And many of us know in grief in this path that, it often puts a strain on your family dynamics as well, whether it's differences between men and women, or spouses, the differences, the way that parents grieve versus the surviving siblings grieve, all of those things. So our hope is to educate employers that this grief journey is a bit different, and ways that they can support their grieving employee as they make their way back to work. Keith and I were so incredibly lucky when Tyler passed away. The two different workforces that we were a part of were so incredibly supportive. The company that my husband was working for at the time, I actually worked there for many years. That's how I met him. I had actually left after we had had our first child. And I actually was working for a local Michael's Arts and Crafts, and he was working for New Horizons Computer Learning Center. And both businesses were incredibly phenomenal. Take all the time that you need. There is no rush for you getting back. Don't worry about getting your pay docked. We will support you however that needs, wants, or looks. And we were so incredibly fortunate to have that kind of support. Sadly, I've sat in many Compassionate Friends meetings where it has been not that case, where they've been expected to come to work quite quickly, at least within the 3 days of bereavement time, if not sooner, and had the expectation that they would perform up to the level of work that they were performing prior to the loss.
Also laughable.
Absolutely.
And look, even if it's not an out of order death, even if it's 96-year-old mom / grandma, 3 days isn't even enough time to make the arrangements and get everyone in town. And and it can take months to settle estates, and all of which brings up really a lot of emotions. Even if you had a beautiful relationship, even if most of the affairs were in order, it's just not enough time. So I'm really grateful to you and the Compassionate Friends for advocating in this way, that it's really important. And I'd like to do a show on this sometime. Maybe you can be part of a panel about this, because this is something I'd really like to see change. We are all going to experience grief, and it shouldn't we shouldn't have to feel like it's an inconvenience to the people who help us, who employ us and allow us to pay our bills, which is what happens. You know, we end up feeling guilty and bad that we're not at work and stressed out about that. And that needs to go away.
I 100% agree. And I think one of the key points is that everybody's grief is very individual and unique. And it also varies according to their personal circumstances that they've had in life. You know, sometimes you have someone who in the past year has been hit with 3 deaths, their grandma, their grandpa, and a cousin, or something like that. When you experience multiple losses in a short period of time, regardless of who the loss is, you know, those circumstances affect your grief and compound it as well. So in the general scheme of things, the idea that we can not only teach the employer, but also the family and friends and coworkers around this grieving person and this grieving family, is that it's not cookie cutter. There's no set steps. There's no timetable to the grief process. It could take weeks, months, or years for that person to get to a sense of quote unquote normalcy. I guess I hate that word, but it seems apropos right here. But if we can educate the workforce, you know, the more supportive somebody feels, in general, they'll have a more productive work experience, right? So
absolutely, and they'll have a healthier life experience. With my friends that didn't expect much for me, expect much from me. It was so liberating. I had never experienced, I write about this in my book, I had never in my life experienced such a low bar of expectation as I did from a handful of friends that were like, I'm surprised you're not a heroin addict. And, you know, they were making a gallows humor joke, but I also could tell that they were really, truly just impressed that I was doing anything at all. And that took so much pressure off of me. And it allowed me to have self-confidence, which is so often destroyed when you're grieving, and especially a child, because I don't care how your child died. I haven't met a parent yet that didn't question every aspect of their parenting after they lost their child. So yes, having the lower the bar, the better the person can do, in my experience, and from watching many other bereaved parents.
I want to thank you very much for being the guest today. Do you have any closing thought about the Compassionate Friends and your involvement with them?
So, you know, I guess my heart goes out to all of you that are listening that have lost a child, a grandchild, or sibling. I can't recommend enough that if you have a local chapter, go, and don't just go once. Don't just go twice. At least give it a shot 3 times.
Just to wrap up, any final thoughts you had about your own experience as a parent with the Compassionate Friends, and or as a board member, and any kind of final words that you'd like to leave with people?
I think we've already touched on a lot of the key points, but just a quick review. The grief process is like a snowflake. It is unique to every specific person. Understanding that what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another, that people, men, women, everybody grieves differently. So if you can communicate, have conversations, let people know how you're feeling. That will help in the grief process, because those that haven't experienced a similar loss, they just don't know what to do. They often don't know what to say. So being your own advocate, and I know that that's hard. Some days we don't have the energy in our grief journey to be our own advocate, but when you do, communicate, let people know what you need, because grief shared is grief halved, right? And if you carry that all by yourself, it's a much heavier burden. Talk with people. If you have local organizations like the Compassionate Friends, go check out their meetings. There's just something to be said about being surrounded by people who just get it. When you can walk into a place where it doesn't matter if you cry the entire time, if you talk, if you don't talk, knowing that it's okay to say your child's name. I'm Tyler's mom. Where else, it's not too often in other places where you get to say that after your child has passed. Just like you said, you were known as Alice's mom for the entire weekend. And that was a gift in and of itself that you didn't know that you needed. So don't do it alone. Seek out like-minded others, support around you. Don't just go once. Go multiple times, because most local Compassionate Friends usually have a topic. And if you decide to go to a meeting and the topic doesn't resonate with you, or it's not right where you are in your grief journey, if one person that night or that day said at least one thing that you resonate with, then your time has been well spent. Go again. Different people show up the next month. Different topics are talked about, different ideas and thoughts. And the whole idea is knowing that you need not walk alone in your grief journey.
Absolutely. I think it's just so wonderful what you're doing and what you've done. And I'm so sorry that you were put in a position that you had to, but I'm grateful that you have. I'm very grateful to you for being on the show to talk about this amazing organization, the Compassionate Friends. And I just really appreciate you. Thank you so much, Jody. For the listeners out there, we will be I always put links, but this show is going to have many, many more links, because there's so many specific things that I want people to have the resource. So thank you so much, Jody. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. Like you said, we wish we didn't have to be here, but I'm so thankful that we are able to share, connect, and communicate. And of course, always talk about our loved ones.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tyler's mom.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on the show or my other work, you can check out thisclubsucks.com or melissamariemonroe.com, or you can find me on Twitter at @MMeaning. May you experience some gentleness on your path today.